Hi everyone. Thank you very much for the introduction and for being here. As it has been said, this paper was a collaborative work between me, Bruno Martorano, who was initially supposed to present and could not attend unfortunately today, and Patricia Giustino from UNU-WIDER. So, do pandemics lead to rebellion? The title, we choose it because it sounds cooler, I would say, but we actually focus a lot more on the role of inequality itself and the way inequality and pandemics interact between themselves. So the first point is actually the literature trying to understand the causes of protests and organized collective dissent is very broad. And one of the prominent theories, started by Gore in 1970 with a seminal paper, is actually that civil unrest is motivated by inequality. However, this theory is not always supported by evidence. There is more recent evidence, for example, by Salt, that says that inequality is only determining protests among top quintile earners. So there is some room here for improving the evidence. And what we thought was that COVID-19 could offer, the pandemic and of course the related restrictions could offer a good opportunity to study the relationship between inequality and protests. So as the virus spread, as we all know in the past 2 years, social discontent increased. Protests increased by almost 30% between January 2020 and January 2021. And in the USA in particular, with our case study, angry protesters have taken to the streets since mid-April 2020, so basically the start of the introduction of the restrictions, to voice their anger. Now, why and how have these protests come about? Initially, the reason behind the protests seemed to be more of political nature, but later on we realized that was actually due well, at least there is anecdotal evidence that it was due to also economic problems generated by the restrictions themselves. Think about lockdowns, for example. So we thought that maybe the highest risk areas, which for us are represented by those with higher inequality, the highest inequality in the country, have faced a perfect storm. And this perfect storm has magnified long-standing social and economic grievances. Now, we want to study with this paper if pre-existing, as I said in the beginning, pre-existing inequality is explaining the relationship between policy restrictions and the incidence of protests, COVID-related protests in the US. A brief introduction on the data. We study a total of over 3,140 US counties in 50 states and the District of Columbia. And for each county, we compiled time variant information on weekly aggregated figures on COVID-related protest events, weekly changes in COVID-related policies, and a measure of income inequality from 2019. So again, this is pre-existing inequality. The period of analysis is January 2020 to December 2021. We have a working paper in which we analyze only the first year, only January 2020 to December 2021, and here we present, let's say, a lengthened analysis. Our initial strategy, it's very simple actually. It's simply analyzing the role of stringency, so this is a measure of how strict the restrictions are, and an interaction between stringency and inequality to give the time variancy to inequality, and a series of controls of which I'll speak about in a minute. However, in this equation, we imply that there is a linear correlation, that the effect of level of policy stringency on protest incidents varies linearly with the level of inequality. So what we thought was to also analyze nonlinear relationship between these elements, and to do this we divide stringency, inequality into quintiles, and we select the different counties based on in which quintile of inequality they are. As I said, here just a brief mention of the controls that we use. We use log total number of COVID-19 cases in previous week. This is to account for the fact that the level in COVID cases might influence the stringency of the measures the week after. Log average rainfall and temperature for each county. These are also factors that have been shown to be associated with protests. And then a series of social and economic controls, for each of the county. These are all pre-pandemic controls. These are the last ones that I mentioned. I'm not going to go through the entire table. Let me just highlight the few relevant facts. So this is our initial strategy from equation 1. As you can see, stringency per se has a negative effect on protests. So the higher the level of restrictions, the lower the number of protests. However, the interaction between stringency and inequality actually is positive, and it's more than, let's say, it's higher than, so that the overall effect is actually a positive effect of inequality and stringency together, showing that in counties with higher inequality and with higher stringency, there is a higher participation in protests, or a higher probability of having protests in our case. Here we show the analysis by quintiles, and in fact we identify nonlinear effects, so that only the most unequal counties, those in Q4 and Q5, the fourth and the fifth quintile of inequality, are actually the ones with more positive effects on protests, on the probability of protests. We then interrogated ourselves on which are the mechanisms that can cause these effects. And as said before, anecdotal evidence points towards economic damage caused by COVID-19 and by the restrictions. So what we thought was that we could first investigate these, unemployment, for example, and then also focus on what political science scholars have highlighted as a series of characteristics that influence protest participation, which are political preferences and group identity. I show you here first the impact of our economic mechanisms. We focus on two measures, consumer expenditure and unemployment level, and we show that indeed the stringency interacted with the quintile of inequality is reducing consumer expenditure only in the two highest quintiles, among the two highest quintiles, although this is only significant, as you can see, for the last quintile. And the same is for unemployment level, so higher unemployment level, well, much higher unemployment levels for the fourth and the fifth quintile. So our findings here are suggestive of the fact that indeed economic downturn might affect participation in protests. Additionally, here I'm just presenting briefly the social and political context here. We analyze it in a different way. We don't see this as an outcome, but we simply rerun our initial models from equation 1 to 3, but dividing our sample between areas with above median and below median trust in the president, values for trust in president, satisfaction with democracy, and the civic engagement. And then we divide our sample between counties that have voted Republican in the 2016 election and those who have voted Democratic candidate in 2016 election. And we find that actually that the results show that protests are more likely to take place in most unequal counties. So these results are, again, significant for the most unequal counties, for counties in which a Republican won in 2016, where trusted in president is below the median, where citizens are less satisfied with democracy, but also where there are higher level of social trust and civic engagement. And we proxy civic engagement by number of religious organizations, civic organizations, political and labor organizations. Now you might wonder, one question that we also asked ourselves is, but what we can do is actually only identify protests if they are related to COVID or not. But protests are not necessarily a bad outcome. One might wonder, why is it bad that most unequal countries protest more? So also what we wanted to investigate is if this relationship between the stringency of restrictions, anti-COVID restrictions, and inequality was also affecting other outcomes. And in this case, we focus, for example, in the vaccination rate. And we actually find, as you can see here, that most unequal countries, in this case third, fourth, and even more for the fifth quintile, have a higher well, actually a lower vaccination rate than the other countries. So the impact of stringency with inequality causes a lower vaccination rate, or is related to a lower vaccination rate in these countries, the most unequal ones. We also tested a series of other outcomes that we can talk more if there is time later on. And we, together with our initial analysis, we also ran an IV strategy for which I have extra slides in case we have time, because one might raise issues of endogeneity of the results. But let's for now focus on the main conclusions. So main results shows that the implementation of policy restrictions to contain the virus led to increases in incidents of protests, COVID-related protests, only in countries with highest level of inequalities. This result validates the theory that civil unrest might be motivated by inequality, or is somehow connected to the levels of inequality. And the mechanism that we identify is that of the drastically adverse economic effects caused by the policies. Again, the example of lockdown, I guess, is what comes to mind to all of us. However, the political and social consequences of such severe economic shock are yet to be completely understood and may take decades, of course, to grasp this fully. Thank you very much.